would like to wander in a different direction to think about the presence of interpreters as more intentional and perhaps also then not just intentional, but also to think about the way they might reflect literary themes rather than purely we're talking a practical aspect. So one intervention that is talked in this, looked at this in this way, is Stephen Brandwood's chapter on interpreters that argues that they mark points in the narrative cultural translation that require the intervention of the work's arch translator, Herodotus himself. But I would actually like to build a little bit on a suggestion that Harrison gives from Stephanie West, that the presence of interpreters constitutes a marker of the especially alien nature of the dialogue at issue. And more sort of to get a little bit further into the argument that I want to make, but again, I'm still making up my mind about a lot of these relevant passages, and I'm very interested in your thoughts and your opinions, as I would like to continue to work this up into an article. But the basic argument that I've come to at this point is that interpreters are a thematic framing device used to create a system's distance, highlight the unfamiliar, and oftentimes as part of characterization of various people. And in doing so, I would argue they fall into two major groups, one of which are examples where they emphasize geographical distance and the marvelous, and another where they perhaps mark a more metaphorical rather than literal distance, marking moral, cultural, or intellectual difference. And finally, I'll talk about how some of these same dynamics can also be seen in other situations that don't have interpreters in them, but are analogous in that they feature the authors highlighting difficulties in communication due to language difference, either when people are unable to communicate because of language difference, or when differences are solved otherwise than through interpreters. So to begin with the first set of examples, ones where it seems to be mostly related to some sort of remoteness or extreme geographical distance, I'd like to talk about the Argopaioi. So these people are remote even from a Scythian perspective. There are no people beyond them. And as fits people at the edge of the world, they live a golden age style existence without weapons. They're sacred. They have this unusual appearance where they're all bald. And when the Scythians contact them, they do so through 7 interpreters and 7 languages. So one question is, why the number 7 here? Is it symbolic? Is it proverbial? Munson, in discussing this passage, brings up a North Carolina expression to be silent in 7 languages. She also brings up the 7-tongued lyre, Pindar Nemean 524. And this sort of symbolic line is also the one that Failing takes, that these interpreters here are symbolic of the boundaries of the known world. It's also possible that the number 7 corresponds to 7 groups living above Olbia: the Scythians, Sarmatians, Budini, Galoni, the Sigitai, Uruk-hai, and Argopaians themselves. And this is the view also taken in Corcella commentary, from which the this map here is taken. But others have taken the number 7 as literal and perhaps reflecting Herodotus's naivete. So Harrison brings up the contrast with the fact that 7 interpreters are needed here versus the single interpreter that's needed to interpret between the Greeks and Galatians. And since that is an arguably more extreme distance, right, that this isn't consistent. And that certainly it is remarkable, or seems like a lot, somewhat strains credulity. But I think that one there is an interesting parallel in Lewis and Clark's journals from September 5th, 1805, at Ross's Hole in modern day Montana, where they trade with some people using, well, in the journals, they say there's a 6-language chain, though modern historians tend to think that the journals have gotten it wrong and it must be 5. That is Salish, Shoshone, Hidatsa, French, and English. So if it is literal, it's perhaps not entirely out of the realm of possibility, but I think even if it's literal, rather symbolic, it's still fitting into general Herodotean interests here focusing on the marvelous, right? That it's chosen perhaps particularly because it is seems a little bit unbelievable, that makes it worthy of note. Another passage following along the same lines, where interpreters seem to mark extreme distance in the edges of the world, happens in the context of Cambyses' planned expedition against the Ethiopians. Before doing so, he needs to find fish eaters from the city of Elephantine who know the Ethiopian language. And this is the only Persian expedition that involves some kind of special linguistic preparation. And probably, again, this relates to their presence on the Ethiopians' presence on the edges of the world, which is also emphasized in the previous description of them, where there are these golden age motifs, talking, for instance, about the table of the sun. And this is also a connection made by Failing, who specifically compares the 7 interpreters with the Argipaioi with this passage here, as again showing that this emphasis on the boundaries of linguistic understanding also corresponding with the barriers of the inhabited world. Before we move on, I just want to make one more note about this passage, which of course that these are not, unlike some of these other passages, these are not literally ever called interpreters, these fish eaters. In fact, they're sort of sent to the Ethiopians and come back. But they certainly serve a similar role. So now that I've talked about where interpreters are tied specifically to geographical distance and the marvelous, I'd like to talk about a different kind of perhaps metaphorical distance or moral, cultural, and intellectual difference. Again, serving to highlight important themes and to characterize different people that they serve in some other situations, that is, interpreters serve. So the first example, and this is the first of a few examples where the translation is just on the handout, since I didn't want to clutter the slide. So do note that if that's, but the first example I'd like to talk about in this context of more metaphorical distance is the famous seminar on comparative funeral practices between the Greeks and the Calations, that is supposed to show the importance of every group's own customs, that they all consider it by far the best. Where first Darius asked some Greeks at his court, how much you'd have to pay them for them to eat their fathers. And of course, you couldn't pay them to do it. And then when we get sort of the other corresponding bit of it, where he's asking the Calations, how much you'd have to give them to cremate their fathers as opposed to eating them, they don't, or actually refuse even to respond, but shout him down. So here, of course, we are talking about geographic extremes, in that the Calations and the Greeks are very far from each other, and the Calations are again more on the edges of the earth. But I think, and this shouldn't be surprising, right, given that physical distance often corresponds with other kinds of difference in Herodotus. But I do think here this is really more an example of interpreters highlighting an extreme cultural difference. So Redfield talks about this as one of examples of extreme practice of pious cannibalism that forms the opposite pole to Greek cremation. And notably, even Mad Cambyses, shortly before this passage, has turned back from his Ethiopian expedition, not when at first he should have, running out of supplies, but when his men begin to cannibalize each other. So it's extreme, even perhaps outside of the Greek world, right, in Herodotus. And I think her interpreters do show up here because of this extreme difference. I think another type of metaphorical distance is at play in the scene of Croesus on the pyre, which also features interpreters. So again, this really doesn't involve the edges of the earth at all, but again, interpreters seem to mark another type of distance or difference. So after Cyrus defeats Croesus and puts him on the fire to burn him alive, famously, he remembers Cyrus's wise words about counting no man blessed till he's died. He says Solon 3 times, and then Cyrus sends his interpreters to ask him what he means. And interpreters then re-enter the scene after getting the full story from Croesus about Solon and his messages to kings. And the distance here is not the distance of the exotic. Neither the Persians nor the Lydians are any more exotic than any other group of barbarians. On the contrary, Croesus is in some ways one of the least exotic foreigners in Herodotus' narrative. Not only is Lydia physically close to Greece, but Croesus is also closely involved with Greek religion, being a famous patron of the Oracle of Delphi and a noted devotee of Apollo. Rather, the distance is an intellectual one. Croesus has only too late realized the truth of Solon's advice to him that, despite how wealthy and powerful he was at the moment, no man could be counted blessed until he had ended his life well. Thus, interpreters' prominence in the narrative serves to highlight how they reflect not just linguistic barriers, but also differing mental and moral states between the two leaders. Cyrus is so different from Croesus because at the beginning of the episode, he has not internalized any of Solon's message for arrogant kings. None of the possible reasons he has for burning Croesus alive are laudable, either as a sacrifice to some god or to fulfill a vow, or even because he wanted to test Croesus's feigned piety by seeing if a god would rescue him from the pyre, which Apollo in fact does. Cyrus's interpreters can only do so much to bridge the gap in wisdom. And so through the mediation of both Croesus and his interpreters, Cyrus does learn ultimately enough from Solon about the vicissitudes of human fortune to keep him from burning Croesus alive, but not enough to keep him from meeting his eventual fate through his hubris at the hands of the Massagetae. This distance, then, suggested by the interpreters, is here moral rather than, as the case of Calations, cultural, is especially appropriate because this gap between the two characters is never really closed. The interpreters also give a dramatic vividness to the conversation, which is another way of perhaps additional view of seeing why they're there. The translation does not seem to be simultaneous here, which is interesting, but they're sent almost like emissaries to talk to Croesus, and then once they figure out everything they want to know, then report the story back to Cyrus, which does also help draw out this part of the story more. And another way in which that drawing out is emphasized is in the repeated aspect of the verbs that are used to ask Croesus, sort of again drawing out the whole process and emphasizing the difficulties of communication. Another similar example I have at handout F, where interpreters again characterize the relationship between two characters at Herodotus' histories, where Silason asks that Darius put him in charge of Samos, from which he has been in exile since the death of his brother Polycrates. And he asked this favor as a benefactor of the king because he gave his cloak to him in Egypt when Darius was still a lowly bodyguard. Darius, when he first learns that Silason has come to see him at Susa, has forgotten this good turn. He is surprised because he has just begun to rule and because hardly any Greeks have ever traveled all the way to the Persian court at Susa. But when he decides to talk to Silason anyway, Darius uses, as we see here, interpreters. These interpreters are just one type of palace attendant that mediate Silason's interaction with Darius. There is also a gatekeeper mentioned, as we see. who is the first one to inform Darius of Silason's presence. Thus, as often, interpreters are not the only factor used to convey distance in the passage, but rather one of several narrative touches used by Herodotus to create this effect. As in Croesus' conversation with Cyrus, interpreters in this episode also help Herodotus craft his narrative and contribute to its themes. The combined effect of these attendants is the same as that which Deioces achieves by isolating himself from the other Medes in an impressive palace at 199. Difficulty of access creates a sense of awe and instills obedience in subjects who cannot perceive their sovereign's human fallibility. This kind of distance is always true of interactions between Persian kings and their subjects, but the narrator highlights it here because of the unique nature of the connection between Silason and Darius. Silason knew that the Persian before he was a king, so interpreters reflect a new difference in relative status. When the two men last met, they were much closer in status, but now the distancing effect of Darius's kingship separates them, and this is further highlighted by the presence of interpreters and fits into Herodotus' thematic interest in the constant rise and fall of human fortunes. Another effect here is that the interpreters characterize Darius as suspicious of Greeks in general, since none have come to him in the short time he's been king, and you cannot imagine that any Greek would be of use to him. And this distance indicated by the use of interpreters thus corresponds with the suspicion that the Persian king bears towards this Greek stranger, his nature, and his aims. So I am a little interested in ways in which some of these passages might reflect or be brought into conversation with uses of interpreters and other authors. So I think there's a comparable example with interpreters in Plutarch and his Cato the Elder, where Cato the Elder deals with the Athenians through an interpreter, even though he knows Greek. This is part of his general characterization and a way of emphasizing the difference between Cato and the Greeks. So it goes along with the fact that he's true to the ways of his fatherland, the ways he mocks those who marvel at Greek things. And finally, he famously goes on to say the Greeks bear their words on their lips, but Romans in their hearts. So again, we see a similar distancing effect, but more explicitly connected to the interpreters here than sort of the more background role they play in Herodotus. So now that I've taken a look at examples of interpreters playing these distancing roles, I'd like to take a look at analogous situations. That is, there we go. That is other situations in which there is a highlighted difficulty of communication as opposed to the normal elision of language difference. So firstly, I'd like to look at examples in which there's an inability to communicate, and then I will go into examples that, and these ones happen to work a little bit sort of the opposite of interpreters, because it's an opposite situation in that there are situations where explicitly no interpreters are needed, that Herodotus explicitly makes clear that there's a common language that these people from different backgrounds are using to communicate, and brings out a certain intimacy. So these examples have similar effects, emphasizing themes or characterizing individuals and creating this, and this play a similar narrative role. And they're analogous also just because they highlight language difference instead of eliding it. So some examples of explicit inability to communicate occur during the silent trade that Carthaginians engage in with people beyond the pillars of Heracles without the use of language. Another example are the Nasamonian youths who are captured by small wizard men in the Libyan desert. And again, they don't know each other's languages. They're unable to communicate. And finally, the Amazons cannot speak with the Scythians until they learn their language, though they ultimately do learn it, though imperfectly, giving rise to this Scythian-like Sarmatian language that is the language of a new people created as a result of this contact, the Sarmatians. So I think all of these examples fit in the paradigm that we saw with the Argypio and the Ethiopians. They're associated with the ends of the earth, geographic extremity. I think the silent trade is very much connected to the marvelous, just like we saw with the seven interpreters, especially the various ways in which it's done, and the extreme amount of trust that actually the two parties have in each other and carry out is also wondrous. I think that we see a similar case with the Nasamonians, where again it's marking the edges of the earth. And while I think that the Amazon example certainly has a little bit of that going on, I think it also fits into Herodotus's interest in the origins of people and the role that languages play in that. For example, similar to the example where the Athenians' Pelasgian ancestors, when becoming Greek speaking, become also Greeks. Similar to how this new people come about from the Scythians and the Amazons speaking this new language as a result of their mothers learning of Scythian, become Sarmatians. So I think something that functions similar, another example from Plutarch where this inability to communicate is highlighted, occurs in his life of Sulla, where a satyr is caught sleeping, supposedly, and is asked repeatedly through many interpreters who he is, but he ultimately produces no intelligible sounds, but rather, neighs like a horse or bleats like a goat. So he does something in between, actually, that frightens Sulla and leads to him being led away. So this isn't not on the edge of the world like these other examples, but it certainly is encountered with something very alien. I think it's interesting to note here the many interpreters, again, not as specific as seven, but again, the sort of the alienness being emphasized by the number of interpreters, the number of different languages they're trying, as presumably to communicate with the satyr in. And I think it also has an interesting parallel with the bat language of the troglodytes in Herodotus 4138. Another example, so now that I've talked about examples where there's the opposite, where there is an inability to communicate, I'd like to talk about a few examples that I think further show the way her interpreters function by showing how when interpreters' languages differences are not elided, but interpreters are not present, where the language in specific is used to communication, it creates an opposite effect, a sort of effect of closeness or intimacy. So Thrasandrus of Archomenos is an example of this, who tells a story of how before the Battle of Plataea, the Thebans and the Persians dine together, and a Persian and Theban share a couch, and Thrasandrus's Persian couchmate asks him specifically in Greek where he's from, and then goes on to tell Thrasandrus that he and the other Persians also fear the outcome of their expedition, but are powerless to escape because they must follow their orders, and because it is impossible for a human being to turn aside what is bound to happen on account of a god. So there are different ways to think about this here. Again, I'm not, like many of these passages, I'm still thinking through exactly what to make of them. But I wonder here if the speaking in Greek relates to an intimacy that increases the pathos. Another interpretation could be that the Persians speaking Greek to avoid being overheard by the other Persians. So maybe perhaps a more prosaic reason, or perhaps they're both operating in some way. Another example where no interpreters are needed is that of Histiaeus, of Miletus, who is being pursued after battle by a Persian soldier and saves himself by crying out who he is in Persian. Of course, this is practical in that it gets his attention, gets him saved. But I wonder if it also highlights his connection to Darius, which is one of the reasons he thinks he can be saved by turning himself in, despite the fact that he's betrayed the king, because he thinks that he is so beloved that he will not be executed. Of course, he gets executed before getting to the king, so the plan doesn't work, but he is so beloved that Darius buries his head. It also could relate to the cunning who's associated with the tyrant elsewhere. So for instance, when he tricks the Scythians to protect the Persians' retreat over a bridge over the Hellespont, or a famous passage where he tattoos a message on the head of a slave and then allows the hair to grow back. So in summary then, I have discussed passages where interpreters highlight geographical distance or also other ways of emphasizing language difference do the same thing, such as the Argopaioi, fish eaters, Nasamonians, Carthaginian silent trade, the Amazons, and the Scythians. Then I've also talked about where they seemed instead to emphasize cultural other difference, as we saw with the Calacians, Croesus on the Pyre, and the Silason example. And finally, where instead the lack of interpreters, communication explicitly without them, markedly without them, indicates an intimacy, so the opposite of a distance. There are other passages with interpreters in Herodotus, specifically ones where he talks about the origins of Egyptian interpreters and them as a class within Egypt. I don't see those as falling within these larger trends that I'm looking at now, but I think that they are important for a full understanding of interpreters in Herodotus. But since they don't fall within this larger bit, I haven't talked about those. In conclusion, interpreters seem to function less as a direct object of Herodotus inquiry and more as a tool to be used in framing its presentation of various other subjects. Primarily, they emphasize distance between interlocutors, but they also tie into some other larger themes. And one thing that I would like, besides just sort of honing this, figuring out more exactly what I think of them, would also be connecting and perhaps drawing some differences and more similarities from Herodotus' use of interpreters as a literary device to how that compares with other authors' use of the same. Okay, well, thank you all very much.